crowd today, huh? Well, that's all right. Before we do anything, we're going to go ahead and pray. So if there's anything that you want to lift up in prayer, just give me your prayer request, and we'll do that to start with. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. Audrey and the new baby. Yes, ma'am. Laura? Okay. Anybody else pretty good? Good? All right. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll jump into it. All right. We pray together. Heavenly Father, we'd like to thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to gather together and all the many things you continue to do for us and keeping us here, keeping us safe, allowing us to get to church. Thank you so much for our church, Lord, and that we can pray to you. And the fact that you hear prayer from someone as insignificant as we are, and that you answer, and you answer in your time. Help us always to be sure of that, and let it know, the Lord, that that brings a whole bunch of peace to us, just to know that you answer prayer. And it might be in your time, and sometimes we don't necessarily know your time, and that's okay too. But help us never take that for granted. Always look to you for the things that we need. Thank you, Lord, for the new babies that you brought into this world, Miss Audrey and Miss Laura. Thanks so much for that, Lord, and letting them be healthy and happy. Watch over them their whole life. And the mothers and the fathers too, Lord, if you would, just keep them in your will and everything that they do. Take care of Tristan today too, he's sick. And Jackie too is feeling a little bit sick too, so keep on being with them. Lord, going forward today, let this be pleasing to you. Let it be something that all can use for your glory, furtherance of your kingdom. We ask it all in Jesus' perfect name. Amen. All right. I didn't bring my thing, so I'm going to have to go here. Actually, I don't have to be up here for a lot, so sorry. I don't like being up here, but yeah, I don't have a clicking thing. Anyhow, this is our Sunday school thing for today. Working? That's like it works. All right, that's the verse I like to use. Sanctify the Lord God in your heart. Be ready always to give an answer to any man. Ask you through a reason of hope that is in you with meekness and fear. And this is from 1 Peter 3:15, so that's the verse that I like to use to start off with. And that's what we're going to try to do, is give you some more ammunition for what we've been talking about. We've been doing the biblical timeline. So I'm not going to go too deep into it today because I'll show you why in a little bit. And this is kind of how, this is all the way down to Peleg at first. This is right after the flood. So you've got Noah at the top and then Noah's son Shem. All those coming down. So you see the different ones there. And that right there is the rebellion that we have at Babel. And Job, I kind of gave you where Job would fit, basically on the timeline. All right, and then one more timeline example is, got some other people. Yeah, let's get past that one. All right, here's another timeline example just for recognition of everybody. So there's Noah at the very top. And then that line that goes down, that's Noah's death after the flood, 350 years after the flood. If you kind of see it up there where his line goes, it actually overlaps Abraham. So Noah lived 2 years into the life of Abraham. So that's how far our timeline has been going. Actually, it goes a little farther than that. Noah's son is Shem. Shem lives right up to that red mark. He lives almost to the end of Abraham's life. He lives almost to the birth of Jacob. He lives but he lives during the time of Abraham and Isaac and all the others that are up above him. And then one more right over here is Eber. Eber outlives Abraham. So, if I told you before, I think, the Preachers of Righteousness is the title that's given to the oldest living patriarch. Adam all the way through Noah, each one basically was the Preacher of Righteousness down to Noah. You see in Noah, it was the oldest living patriarch all the way up to the birth of Abraham. Once Noah actually passes off the scene, the next oldest living patriarch would be Shem. Noah and Shem both rode on the ark and built the ark. So, I mean, these are guys that have firsthand account knowledge and can tell everybody all the way down to even Abraham and Isaac. This is exactly what happened during the flood. All right, and then the next oldest living patriarch, there's two that are below Shem. Both of them died before Eber. So Eber turns into the next oldest living patriarch after Shem, and he lives past Abraham into Isaac and into Jacob. So that is Eber. Abraham is called a Hebrew because of Eber. Eber's name, Hebrew. That's where it comes from. And once Eber passes off the scene, the next person that's the oldest living patriarch is going to be Isaac. Okay, so Isaac is the preacher of righteousness until he dies, and then that title passes to his son, whose name is Jacob. So Jacob is the next patriarch that is considered to be the preacher of righteousness at this point. All right, and this is how far that we've gotten. So I did ask kind of a question when we got to the end, and this is basically that question. Jacob, the one that we saw there, Jacob's entrance into Egypt is when he is basically 130 years old. That's from Genesis 47. Joseph is another one that we'll not discuss. But anyway, this is what I ask you, though. Israel's time in Egypt. How long was Israel in Egypt? If anybody remembers this. There's a couple of verses ago here. Genesis 15:13 tells you that Israel was there for 400 years. I'm hurrying. Stop yelling at me. I'm hurrying. All right. 400 years for Genesis 15:13. Acts 7:6. So in the New Testament, it actually says 400 years again. Keep on going. Exodus chapter 12 and verses 40, it says 430 years. Verse 41, it says 430 years. So 400, 400, 430, 430. And then Galatians 3:17 says 430. So we've got 400, 400, 430, 430, 430. And then in the next one is Acts 13:20, and it says 450. And after that, we got 1 Kings 6:1, and it says 480. So 400, 400, 430, 430, 450, 480. Which one is it? That's kind of what we're getting at, was Israel's time in Egypt. How long did it last? All right, well, we're going to discuss that. How long were they there? But before we do, does anybody recognize that creature? It's a what? Siamese cat. So we know it's a cat, and it's called a Siamese cat. Correct. You've heard of Siamese cats. Anybody heard of Siamese twins? Probably, yeah. Siamese cats, Siamese twins were named basically from the area that they came from. So Siamese, what area did they come from? Siam. Exactly. Siam was around for, 700 years, started about 1300s AD. So Siam was all the way through there, all the way up till where we know Siamese cat, Siamese twins, but I ain't even thinking about it. If I were to ask you, can somebody point to me where Siam is on the globe? Can anybody do that? Yes, it is Thailand today. It is not Siam. You will not find Siam on the globe, even though we know Siamese. We know that basically so as that culture was around since the 1300s. But yes, it is Thailand today. 1939, I think, is when Siam changed its name to Thailand. So you'll see that there are basically the same area, not quite, but basically the same area, and it has two different names, Siam or Thailand, okay? Just remember that. Keep that in the back of your mind for what we're going to see right here in a second. All right. So I told you a little while, or the last time I was up here, that I was going to show a video, and that's basically what we're going to do. It's a video. I just wanted to give you a precursor of this is exactly what happens. So without further ado, let's see if I can stop it. And now I got to do this. All right. Okay, and here we go. So some of this stuff that you'll hear in here, I'll go ahead and tell you that I do not agree 100% with this guy, but most of the stuff I do. And everybody in here should not agree with any man 100%, by the way, including me. So don't do that, because all men are fallible. All men have fallen short of the glory of God, so we do things incorrectly. You'll probably hear, you will hear about two other translations. Has anybody heard of the Septuagint? Okay, Septuagint is Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, not authorized by God, okay? There's another one that you'll hear that's called a Samaritan Pentateuch. Has anybody heard of that? Heard of the Samaritan Pentateuch? Okay. Basically, it's kind of like the Hebrew Old Testament, but it's been changed. Samaritan, if you think of Samaritans, Good Samaritan, anti, but anyway, their translation is kind of in a Proto-Hebrew alphabet, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's the 5th century BC, so it's an older document, and the Septuagint is an older document too, in the 3rd century. Just want to let you know that you'll probably hear those two terms, Septuagint and Samaritan Pentateuch. Anyway, that's what they are. Simon, thing. And here we go. All right, and there'll probably be
40.
some...
Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And if you were to look up every modern translation, you would see that they say exactly the same thing. And verse 41 doubles down on this, saying, "And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." So you can see that in both verses, 40 and 41, that the 430 years is connected with Egypt. The starting point of this period would be attached back to Genesis 47:28 that says, "And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years." So Jacob lived for 147 years, and of his 147 years, we can subtract back the 17 years that he lived in Egypt, which gives us the 130. This means that at 130 years old, Jacob and the rest of the nation of Israel entered Egypt, which is recalled in Genesis 46. So, with Exodus 12:40 in mind, we have Israel entering into Egypt in the 130th year of Jacob. Then, the 430 years of the Exodus from Exodus 12:40 is the length of time between these two events. Now, the other verse that's attached to Exodus 12:40 is Genesis 15:13 that says, "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Stephen reiterated the same thing in Acts 7 with saying, "And God spoke on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage, and entreat them evil for 400 years. So on our timeline, the 400 years prophesied by God to Abram falls under the umbrella of Exodus 12:40 and likely ends with the Exodus taking place, because any earlier would have Jacob being in slavery. Now, because of the recorded accounts of the birth years of the patriarchs in Genesis, we can add them easily into our timeline. So, Jacob was born when Isaac was 60, and he lived for 180 years. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100, and he lived for 175 years altogether. And Genesis 12:4 says that Abraham was 75 when he was called. So there are two periods here. First is with the patriarchs and the 12 tribes living in Canaan, and the period when Israel lived in Egypt. So why is the shorter chronology even proposed? Seems pretty cut and dry at this point, doesn't it? Well, let me put on the shorter proponent's hat and let me lay it out for you. The issue here is that it's a mathematical impossibility for the 430 years to take place between Israel entering Egypt and leaving it in the Exodus. Let me show you. Moses lived for 120 years, and it was in his 80th year that the Exodus took place from Exodus 7:7. Now, why this is a problem for longer proponents is from Moses' genealogy recorded in Exodus 6. It says that Amram was the father of Moses, who lived for 137 years. And his dad was Kohath, who lived for 133 years. And his dad was Levi, who was one of the sons of Jacob, who lived for 137 years. So, on the timeline, we see the connection from Jacob to Moses. And since Levi is older than Joseph, we need to move him back before Joseph just by a few years. So, the only way for Moses to realistically be born is if you have Kohath and Amram both being born on the year of their father's death, just to allow a couple of years left for Moses to be born. But why this really fails is because in Genesis 46 it says, "And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, and their little ones, and their wives, in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they gotten into the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob, all of his seed with him, and his sons, and his sons' sons with him, his daughter, and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt." Verses 5 and 7 say clearly that Jacob's grandchildren were part of the group. And verse 11 says that Kohath, the son of Levi, was part of the caravan group. So that means that Kohath has to be moved back at the time of entering into Egypt. This creates, at minimum, a 90-year gap between Amram's last possible year for death and Moses' birth.
Did you know that Amazon has a $50 million fund that they have to pay out every month? And here's how you can get a cut of it. My name is Charlotte Mickelson, and we help everyday people grow their income with this one simple method. And
But we shorter proponents aren't done yet, because in the caravan list, it says that Reuben's son, Palu, entered into Egypt. But in Numbers 26, it records Dathan and Abiram being contemporaries of Moses after the Exodus. So you see, there's only 2 generations back from Dathan and Abiram to Palu, who entered into Egypt. Now, you are not going to be able to cover 430 years with only 2 generations. And also, on Judah's line, this causes the same type of issue. Because you see that Judah's line also includes his grandsons from Pharez with Hezron and Hamel, and this is an issue because of at the end of Ruth, Pharez and Hezron start the line that goes to King David. And it says that Hezron begat Ram, who fathered Amminadab, who Amminadab fathered Nahshon, who was contemporary of Moses from Numbers 1:7. So this leaves only a 3-generational gap between Moses' line to cover a 430-year period. Sounds pretty good, right? But how do we reconcile those earlier verses that say that it was 430 years that they would be in Egypt? Well, Paul actually helps us out in Galatians 3 by saying that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. So Paul is saying that the Mosaic law came 430 years after the Abrahamic covenant. So on our timeline, Paul says that there were 430 years from the Exodus back to the call of Abram. But how do we resolve those apparent contradictions here? Well, Exodus 12:40 in the Septuagint reads, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, was 430 years." This is also confirmed in the Samaritan Pentateuch translation that says, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt, was 430 years." And since the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch predate the Leningrad Codex, which is the base for the Masoretic text, by over 1,000 years, this tells us that the Masoretic scribes dropped the Canaan part from Exodus 12:40, which led to all modern translations being incorrect. So on our timeline, it is fine because Exodus 12:40 should read in Canaan as well, so Galatians 3:17 and Exodus 12:40 are now in harmony. And this is backed up by Josephus, who agreed with the shorter chronology, saying, "And they left Egypt in the month of Nisan, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt." And he gets 215 years in Egypt because there were only 25 years from the call of Abram to Isaac's birth. 60 years later, Jacob was born, and Jacob was 130 when they entered into Egypt. So, altogether, that gives us 215 years in Canaan and 215 years in Egypt for a perfect division of time in each. But what about the 400 years from Genesis 15:13? Well, yes, the 400 years has to be scaled back. This starting point lands on the 5th year of Isaac as we subtract the 400 years from the 430, giving us 30. Then we subtract the 25 years from the call to Isaac's birth, giving us the 5th year of Isaac. Starting the 400 years here works because of what is said in Genesis 21. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son Ishmael of Hagar the Egyptian, which had been born unto Abraham, and he was mocking. Paul speaks of this in Galatians 4:29, saying, "At that time, however, the son born by the flesh persecuted the son born by the Spirit. It is now the same." So Paul is saying that the persecution of Israel started with Ishmael and Isaac. And since Jewish weaning could last up until 5 years, then we see Isaac's weaning and Ishmael starting the 400-year persecution coinciding with one another. Pretty impressive proposal, right? They have the chronologies working together. They have genealogies with only 2 and 3 generations between going in and out of Egypt. They got Josephus backing them up, and even seems to have Paul agreeing with them that the Septuagint is the correct reading by having Canaan included with Egypt in Exodus 12:40. So, how does the longer proponent respond to all of this? First, there's a mandatory appeal to the Septuagint over the Masoretic text because without the in Canaan included, they have no basis to overrule the text. So they say the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch must have been drawing off an earlier and more trustworthy Hebrew source and outdates the Leningrad Codex by over 1,000 years. But what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? There are 2 scrolls that contain Exodus 12:40, and neither of them have in Canaan in them. So there is no appeal to an earlier dating when the Dead Sea Scrolls come from the same period. It is very likely that both the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch inserted in the land of Canaan to satisfy the same chronology issue that we are discussing here. Next, what needs to be pointed out is that the Septuagint and Samaritan Pentateuch have different orders in when the Israelites dwelt in Canaan and Egypt. In this case, the Septuagint is wrong in putting Canaan second, and if both of these were pulling off an earlier and more reliable Hebrew scroll, then why do they have different orders? Next, what shorter advocates don't tell you is that there are other Septuagint versions that don't include Canaan. And the majority of earlier sources agree with Egypt only. This gives a higher probability that Canaan wasn't part of the original. So appealing to Josephus can be crossed off because likely he was just repeating what he read in the Septuagint. Now, as far as it seems that Paul's agreeing with the Septuagint in Galatians 3:17, what shorter proponents won't bring up is what Paul said in Acts 13. Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm he led them out of it. And for about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. So Paul starts off the history recall with their time in the land of Egypt, and then says 40 years in the wilderness took place, and then there was the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. So it's Egypt, wilderness, conquest. Now verse 20. And all of this took about 450 years. And after that he gave them judges unto Samuel the prophet. So the timeline needs to include Paul's very clear statement that says the time span from Egypt to the end of Joshua's conquest was about 450 years. And likely Paul was counting the 400 years of Genesis 15 right below it, plus the 40 years in the wilderness, and roughly the 7 years that it took to conquest of Canaan, which gives you 470 years, just like he said, about 450 years in verse 20.
I'm shocked at how few people actually know why they're losing their hearing. They have no idea what's happening inside their ear. The hairs inside your inner ear.
So the shorter chronology doesn't jive with what Paul said in Acts 13. But what about Galatians 3:17? Yes, we know that it is referring to the Abrahamic covenant, but this covenant wasn't just confirmed and made with Abraham. It was also made with Isaac and Jacob. And just by coincidence, God confirmed the covenant with Jacob in Genesis 46. And Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. This is God confirming the covenant with Jacob. And I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. So on the timeline, Galatians 3:17 can easily be interpreted as Paul referring to the confirming of the covenant to Jacob right before Israel enters Egypt, and this harmonizes with what he said in Acts 13. So you can see there is no need to appeal to the Septuagint. The longer chronology satisfies all 4 verses. Now obviously the shorter chronology has problems with Acts 13. But another thing to point out is that about Isaac's weaning at age 5 is that there is no possible way to know that he was actually 5 when this took place. He could have been 4 or 3 or even just 2. There is no biblical way to prove that he was 5. It's just a guess. The next thing is that you actually cause yourself a textual problem with Genesis 15 prophecy, because look at what God tells Abraham. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. There's 3 parts to verse 13. Not a land of their own, then they shall serve them, and they shall be afflicted. The land of Canaan was and is basically Abraham's because God gave it to him. But the serving and being afflicted, when did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob serve the Canaanites? It never happened. And when did the Canaanites afflict them either? This never happened. They actually got along pretty decently with them. And you can't appeal to Ishmael or Esau because they are not Canaanites. So verse 14 says, And also that nation, notice the singular tense, whom that they shall serve, will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. Notice that Abraham was promised to die in peace. If we go with the shorter chronology, Abraham would have been part of the 400 years of affliction and died seeing Isaac and Jacob suffering the same. This is hardly a peaceful death for Abraham that God promised him. And chapter 47 speaks of Jacob with Pharaoh, saying, And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. I doubt Jacob is going to bless somebody who is afflicting him and his family. Plus, Joseph, his son, is the second most powerful man in Egypt at this point. And there is absolutely no way that you can say that Israel was being afflicted during the 17 years that Jacob was in Egypt. And so verse 16 also says, But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Notice God said that they would return back to Canaan. This whole 400 years is talking about a single nation that would be doing the afflicting and forcing them into bondage, not 2. So, the 400 years has to be moved ahead into the time of Egypt, as they do fit the bill for all the descriptions laid out in Genesis 15. So the shorter chronology has a lot of textual problems. Their whole timeline is built off speculative arguments like Isaac being weaned at age 5, Ishmael's mocking counts as affliction, although Abraham immediately kicked him and Hagar out of the family, and or that the Masoretic text dropped the Canaan from verse 40. They are simply not making exegetical arguments. So all that's left in this debate are over the genealogical arguments. And on the surface, it seems like the chronology to Moses does leave a 90-year gap, and it's illogical to think that you can cover 430 years with only 2 generations from the line of Reuben. Now, all these arguments stem from Genesis 46 of who is listed entering into Egypt. Now, while this may seem like a humongous hurdle for longer chronologists to get over, it actually causes chronological problems for the shorter proponents. We have to get into minutiae to sort this all out. Jacob's family tree is as follows, from his 2 wives and 2 concubines, in which the order of the boys were born. Genesis 46 says, and gives us the list of the sons in green to the 12 tribes with grandsons to Judah and Asher in purple. Asher's daughter Sarah in pink is the only granddaughter in the whole family. The straightforward reading of Genesis 46 would be that all these grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Jacob were born in Canaan and then moved all together as a 70-person unit into Egypt. A point is that if you read Numbers 26, you would see the list of the second census of the tribes and clans of Israel. And what you see here is checked off are the clans that came out of the tribes, and with some crossed off who likely merged into others. The one thing that you should grab our attention with is that Dan's son Shuan would be the only son born to any of Jacob's sons after they entered into Egypt. Keep in mind that Joseph was 40 when Israel entered into Egypt, so his 10 older brothers are likely still in their early 40s. So how likely is it that Jacob only had 1 more grandson born in Israel after they entered into Egypt? And remember, God just told him that he was going to make him a great nation. So this should be really unexpected that his 12 sons would stop having kids after they entered into the land. Abraham was 100 when he had Isaac, Isaac was 60 when he had Jacob, and Jacob had Joseph when he was 90 by subtracting off the 40 from his 130th year when they entered into the land. So it's odd to think that the 12 had no more sons or daughters for the next 70 years in Egypt, where their whole goal was to become a great nation. So yes, this is challenging the interpretation to Genesis 46. But let's say that we need to stick with the whole 70 all being born prior to entering into Egypt. Let's see how the chronology actually lays out with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren being born.
How to store and sort all your photos and videos in seconds. No computer knowledge required. This tiny device can safely back up and store thousands of pictures and videos.
On Joseph's timeline, you have him being sold into slavery by his brothers when he was 17, according to Genesis 37. The next 13 years, he is in prison until he interprets Pharaoh's dream of the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine to occur in the land. That means that Joseph was 37 when the famine starts and 44 when it ends. The next piece is that in the 2nd year is when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for help, and Joseph reveals himself on their 2nd return after he kept Benjamin as a hostage. Just keep that little nugget in mind. So after getting back home, they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive, and God tells Jacob it's safe to move down. This likely happens in the 3rd year of the famine that Israel enters into Egypt. So all of Jacob's grandchildren and some great-grandchildren need to be born prior to this line. So from Genesis 46 caravan list, we are going to import Judah's list, as this was one of the ones that was pointed out, and that there's only 3 generations from Hezron to Moses to cover 430 years. What I'm going to show is that it's impossible for Hezron to be even alive before entering into Egypt. Because right after Joseph is sold into slavery in Genesis 37, chapter 38 starts off by saying, "And it came to pass at that time, when Joseph was sold into slavery, that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her. And she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah." So there's Judah's first 3 sons. So at bare minimum, Shelah's birth took 2 years after Joseph was sold into slavery. So you have a 22-year window for both Hezron and Hamel to be born, so you can see the problem that's brewing here. The next thing in Genesis 38 is that Judah gets a wife for named Tamar. So this should sound familiar, but what we should be seeing here is that realistically, he couldn't have been married until he was likely 12-ish. So our 22-year window collapses down to a 10-year window for both Hezron and Hamel to be born in. But we know that is put to death by God for being evil. Judah tells Onan that he needs to fulfill his brotherly obligation to marry Tamar, get her pregnant as a dependent of He doesn't do it, and God puts him to death for being evil. So it's likely that at least 1 year or 2 has passed, and the window for Hezron and Hamel is now down to 8 or 9 years. We next read that in Genesis 38:11, "Then said Judah to Tamar his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow at thy father's house, till Shelah my son has been born, or grown up. For he has said, Let peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house." So Tamar is waiting for Shelah, Judah's last current son, to grow up and marry her. Next it says, "And in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and went unto his sheep shearers to Tamar, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And Tamar saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him to a wife." So the lines "in the process of time" and "Shelah was grown" has to be at least a year or more from Onan's death. So we could think that these events of Tamar posing as a prostitute and getting pregnant from Judah, then giving birth to the twins Perez and Sarah, has to be at least 2 full years from the last point. So the window is now down to 5 to 6 years for Hezron and Hamel to be born. What this really means is that Perez would need to become a dad by age 5. You see, there's a potential that the 70 listed here in Genesis 46 is not an exact list of those who were born in Canaan and then journey down into Egypt with Jacob. Yes, I know the text reads that way, but we are reading it with a modern translation in mind. The number 70 is a special number and is likely being casted against the table of nations found in Genesis 10. So, if you allow for this possibility, then the 90-year gap can be moved forward and allow for a late burst of Kohath, Amram, and Moses in their fathers' lives. The shorter proponents will quickly reply to this with Numbers 26:59 that says, "And the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, whom her mother bare to Levi in Egypt, and she bare unto Amram, Aaron, and Moses, and Miriam their sister." So the reply is Jochebed would need to be nearly 270 years old to give birth to Moses. See how fun this merry-go-round is? So what the shorter proponent is saying is if we go back to Kohath being born before entering Egypt, then shorten our chronology to 215 years with the listed parents, then it looks completely more coherent with Jochebed and Amram being Moses' father. But the longer proponent would say, well, yeah, but you're not even considering Acts 13:20. But there's a whole other character that needs to be added to this tapestry, and that is Joseph. With his locked-in dates, we can see that there is only a 64-year gap between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. So the massive turning of events from having it good with Joseph being number 2 in the land to everyone being enslaved is only 64 years in between. The next difficulty for the shorter period are the generations from Ephraim to Joshua. Genesis 50 verse 23 reads, "And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation." And 1 Chronicles 7 records that there were 10 generations between Ephraim and Joshua. So, with Joseph's cutoff line inserted in, we would have 6 generations to be born in a 100-year window.
This weird scissor-replacing gadget is quickly becoming the most popular Christmas gift of 2024. It makes breaking down boxes and cutting tough materials easier than ever, eliminating...
Ultimately, the tug-of-war match here resides over how strict you are with the genealogies. Keel observed that the genealogies do not always contain a complete enumeration of all the separate links, but very frequently, intermediate links of little importance are omitted. And Edwin Thiel says that some considerable period was involved is clear from the fact that Joseph, before his death, saw the children of the 3rd generation of both his sons, and that at the time of Exodus, Amram and his brothers were already regarded as founders of clans. So, main chronology scholars tend to lean towards the longer period. But there's one more thing that the shorter proponents need to address, and that's the population growth of Israel while they're in Egypt. Because they are saying that Israel went from 70 to nearly 1.5 million people in 215 years. So you would need to double the population 15.5 times. This would mean that your population would be doubling every 14 years. Is that possible? Sure. Both sides will say that God was blessing Israel while they're down there to make them a great nation, and nothing is impossible with God. But a very strong population growth objection to the shorter view is that with the Amorites. Numbers 3:27-28 say that the Kohathites were divided in Moses' time into 4 branches: the Amorites, the Uzzielites, the Isharites, and the Hebronites, who consisted together of 8,600 men and boys. Now, if you were to divide this equally, each clan would have 2,150 men. And since Moses had a whopping 2 sons, that would mean that Amram, his dad, would have needed to have nearly 2,000 more sons and grandsons in only an 80-year period. Kenneth Kitchen argues that Exodus 6:16-20 gives the tribe Levi, the clan Kohath, and the family group Amram by Jochebed, to which Moses and Aaron belong, but they're not their actual parents. So according to Kitchen, Exodus 6 is an incomplete genealogy. And this is possible because Jesus' genealogy in Matthew is incomplete. They go from King Josiah to Jehoiachin by skipping directly over Jehoiakim, his actual dad. So his view does have biblical potential. Overall, we see that there's many ways to skin this cat, and there are textual challenges to both sides. But at the end of the day, this is not a salvation issue. And we're not going to know or declare exactly who the Pharaoh was of Joseph or Moses if we finally agree on which one is right. So it is fun to speculate and to discuss, but at the end of the day, Moses didn't put it down for us, so we'll actually never know. So whatever your view is, don't freak out over somebody having a different one. At the end of the day, both sides see Jesus as Lord and King, and that's all that matters. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. In the meantime, stay salty.
Yes. Don't really know how to turn that thing off yet. Anyway, all right. Everybody get from the video there? So we know how long they were there, right? That's what I really wanted to use this video because he said that at the end. That was very important. All this stuff, I can go back here and give you all the timeline stuff. At the end of all of it, the only thing that really matters is Christ and your relationship to him. And that's exactly what he pointed out. So there's a couple other ones, but you know, this is the closest one for everybody to hear the different views, because I wanted you to hear those different things about 430 versus 450 versus 480 versus 400. There's all kinds of different things to go along with that. Anyhow, that's where we are today. So next week we'll be done with the timeline. Next week is when I'm going to finish it all. Okay, I think I'm going to finish presenting it. I'm not going to finish the timeline because it doesn't end it. But I'm going to finish our presentation of that. We'll probably start with the creatures again next week. So that's going to be something that we just do from there. Anyway, I think we have choir, probably. We do have choir. Okay, so we're going to do choir right after this, and then give it into the service. So appreciate you all being here and listening to all that stuff. So